Hi students, in this video we're going to talk a bit about constructing moral arguments. It'll be a bit of an introduction. I'll have a couple other videos about how to construct principled moral arguments and analogical moral arguments, but here I just want to introduce some of the basic ideas. Hopefully you're appreciating this image here, caution, construction area, authorized personnel only. Yeah, we're going to be constructing arguments. You gotta watch out. I guess I'll give you authorization to learn this stuff. Okay, so what is an argument? Hopefully you've already taken a look at the video introducing how to evaluate arguments. That gives you a nice background about why we're interested in arguments and that sort of thing. But as a quick refresher, so what an argument is a group of statements in which reasons called premises are offered in support of some further claim, which we call a conclusion. Here's an example. We've got this shape. This diamond has four sides, and if a figure has four sides, then it's a quadrilateral. Therefore, this diamond is a quadrilateral. Now, here we're not, nothing that's being said is particularly mind-blowing, but what we're just doing is sort of giving reasons to think that the conclusion's true. So why think that this diamond is a quadrilateral? Well, it has four sides. That's one reason. The other reason that combines with that is that if a figure has four sides, then it's a quadrilateral. If those two things are true, then we've got to conclude that that diamond is quadrilateral. Now in our class, right, in this class, we're primarily interested in moral arguments, which are arguments for moral claims. What's a moral claim? A moral claim is a claim about what someone should or ought to do, or a claim about what's morally wrong, or morally permissible, or morally obligatory, etc. So for example, right, the diamond argument isn't a moral argument. It's not an argument for a moral claim, but this argument is. Smoking cigarettes makes you look cool, and if something makes you look cool, then you should do it. Therefore, you should smoke cigarettes. Right? This argument's a moral argument because it's arguing for a moral conclusion that you should do this thing. You should smoke cigarettes. Now, a lot of us probably think that argument's not a good one. Right? There's something wrong with that conclusion. That may be, but it's still a moral argument, even if the thing it's telling us to do is not correct. Okay, so when we construct moral arguments, we'd like to put them into what I call standard form or premise-conclusion form. What we do in standard form or premise-conclusion form is that we list the argument's premises above its conclusion, and then we label those things. So to take the example we just were using, we might say premise 1, smoking cigarettes makes you look cool. Premise 2, if an act makes you look cool, then you should do it. Conclusion, therefore you should smoke cigarettes. Now, one thing we might need to think about doing at some point, right, is figuring out, well, what conclusion are we trying to argue for? What conclusion is someone else trying to argue for? The conclusion is the thing that they're trying to convince us of. And that, for the argument we just looked at, is that we should smoke cigarettes. So that's the conclusion. The other sort of things that are given as reasons to accept that conclusion are what I've listed here as the premises, premise 1 and premise 2. So smoking cigarettes makes you look cool. If something makes you look cool, you should do it. Now the reason why we put arguments into standard form is that doing so helps us evaluate the argument's soundness. If we know sort of what the premises are, and we sort of state them out real clearly, then we can see, well, do those premises guarantee the conclusion? Like if they're true, do they guarantee the truth and conclusion? There we're checking for validity. We can also check whether or not the premises themselves are true. If we state them out very explicitly, then we can look and we can say, well, does smoking cigarettes make you look cool? Is that true? Or what about the second premise? If an act makes you look cool, is it true that you should do it? By writing them out real clearly, we've highlighted them and we can sort of take a look and reflect on whether or not that argument is sound. Okay, so what do I mean by sound? So in order to be sound, all sound arguments have true conclusions, and the arguments for them are what we might think of as airtight, right? In order to have this property of being sound, an argument has to be valid, which is to say that the truth of its premises guarantees the truth of its conclusion. That is, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Now that's a great feature to have, right? If your argument is valid, then we know that if its premises are true, then we've got to accept its conclusion as well. So validity is like the sort of first crucial criteria we're looking for in a good argument. Second, it's got to have true premises. So almost all the arguments that I'm going to give you this semester are going to be valid because an argument, it's got to have that good structure in order to be a sound argument, in order to be a convincing argument. The thing that's maybe not always going to be true is that those arguments might have false premises, right? So they might, usually they'll be valid, but maybe they don't have true premises, and if they're unsound, it's usually because of the problem with the premises. So let's take a look at the argument we just looked at. So smoking cigarettes makes you look cool. If an act makes you look cool, then you should do it. Therefore, you should smoke cigarettes. Now, if we were in person, I would often sort of ask you, what premise do you think is false, or is it invalid? Like, what's the problem with this argument? And I'll just sort of tell you, right, the argument's valid. If the premises are true, then the conclusion's got to be true. And sometimes people say, well, I think that first premise is false. Smoking cigarettes doesn't make you look cool. But I've got a good response to that. So here's my response. Look at that guy. He's smoking a cigarette. He looks pretty cool to me. Or this lady, right? She's smoking a cigarette. She looks pretty cool. So again, I'm just giving you evidence, right? Smoking cigarettes makes you look cool. You want to look like that guy? Smoke a cigarette. Want to look like her? Smoke a cigarette. And then, if you're not convinced yet, this last image I think will convince you. So, on the left, right, that guy looks like a nerd. On the right, put on some sunglasses, put a cigarette in his mouth, and he looks like a sick mofo. Haha, I think that's pretty funny. Hopefully you're appreciating that at home, too. I think that's pretty great. Anyway, what's the point? You're like, John, come on, cut it out. What are we doing here? The point is, maybe that first premise isn't so bad after all. Maybe smoking cigarettes does make you look cool. Now, in a way, that claim is too general, right? It doesn't make you look cool all the time. Maybe there's something uncool about someone who's smoking all the time. Yeah, maybe that's right. But I think the more obvious problem with this argument, and the problem with a lot of the arguments we're going to be looking at, is not that sort of first kind of empirical claim about how some action, what its effects are, but rather the sort of moral claim that we get in premise 2. So what I want to say is that this argument's clearly unsound because it has a false premise, and that premise is that second premise, premise 2. Just because something makes you look cool doesn't mean you should do it. There might be all sorts of things that look really cool to do, but that you shouldn't do. Your parents maybe gave you that example, right? If everybody's jumping off a bridge, are you going to do it? Maybe it looks pretty cool to jump off a bridge, but it doesn't mean that you should do it too. All right, here's another argument. Let's take a look at this one. Premise 1 says smoking cigarettes is unhealthy. Premise 2 says if an act is unhealthy, then you have a reason not to do it. Conclusion, therefore you shouldn't smoke cigarettes. So note, this argument has the opposite conclusion of the first one, right? Maybe you thought maybe you disagreed with the conclusion of the first argument. You thought, no, I shouldn't smoke cigarettes. So now I've given you an argument for that conclusion. But even if the conclusion of this argument's true, right? Even if it's true that you shouldn't smoke cigarettes, that doesn't mean it's a good argument. And in fact, I want to say that this argument's unsound too. The problem here is that the argument is invalid. Even if the premises are true, it doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Why is that? One way to test is just say, well, say I know that the premises are true. Can I be sure that the conclusion is also true? So premise 1 says smoking cigarettes is unhealthy. Premise 2 says if an act's unhealthy, then you have a reason not to do it. Can I conclude from those things that I shouldn't smoke cigarettes? No, I can't. And the problem, roughly, is that just because I have a reason not to do something doesn't mean I shouldn't do it. There might be things that I have a reason not to do, but that I have more reason to do them, and so I should do them in the end. Now, say I'm not as perceptive, or I don't sort of pick up on that. One way that I can figure out whether or not an argument's valid or invalid is by looking at the form that the argument takes. So here, what I would say is this argument, smoking cigarettes is this action, and then I'm saying that that action has this property, an empirical property. It's unhealthy. If I smoke cigarettes, I'm going to be unhealthy. Okay, premise 2 says something like, if an act has this empirical feature, it makes you unhealthy. So smoking cigarettes is unhealthy. Smoking cigarettes, an act, has this empirical property. Premise 2 says, if an act has that empirical property, E, then you have a reason not to do it. It has this moral property, then you have a reason not to do it. Now the conclusion, instead of saying, therefore, you have a reason not to smoke cigarettes, it says something a bit too strong, right? It says, you shouldn't smoke cigarettes. So what it's saying is this act, smoking, has this different moral property. It's not just that you have a reason not to do it, but it says you have this moral property, you shouldn't do it there. And so what we'll see in the following videos is that there's something wrong with the structure of this argument. Even if the premises are true, they don't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. What we can infer from the premises is that we have a reason not to smoke, but this conclusion goes too far and it says you shouldn't smoke. Now, one thing we could do is we could change the conclusion by changing the conclusion to, therefore you have a reason not to smoke cigarettes. Or alternatively, if we think that's the right conclusion and we want to give a valid argument for it, we could change the premise from you have a reason not to do it to therefore you shouldn't do it. If we changed it in that way, then we would have a valid argument. So whether or not an argument's valid or not is going to depend in a way on kind of some fine details, right? You want to be as precise as possible throughout the argument to make sure that it lines up. All right, so finally, for now, when we're interested in constructing moral arguments, we want to focus our attention on the fact that good arguments need to be valid. So we're going to sort of set the truth part aside for now, focus on the fact that they need to be valid. In order to be valid, arguments must be such that the truth of their premises guarantee the truth of their conclusions. One way to ensure this is to put them into valid argument forms. And any argument that takes a valid argument form is going to be valid. So that's what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and put our arguments into a valid argument form. And that's what we're going to look at in the following videos. One is principled moral arguments. The other one's on analogical moral arguments. So you can learn more about valid argument forms for moral arguments in those videos. All right, we'll see you then.